For years, no maid lasted in this mansion. But that morning, Adrian witnessed something that would change his family forever.
Mercer Estate stood above Blackwater Cove like a private kingdom, surrounded by stone walls, endless gardens, and windows that looked out over the ocean. Its owner, Adrian Mercer, was a billionaire who had spent most of his life building an empire that seemed impossible to break. But inside that mansion, there was one problem money could never solve. His 18-year-old daughter, Vivian, had become impossible to control. She was beautiful, intelligent, and deeply spoiled. She treated every employee as though they existed only to serve her moods. Over the previous year, 14 housekeepers had walked away from the estate. Some lasted only a few days. Others disappeared after a single argument with Vivian. The estate manager, Samuel Brooks, had stopped trying to convince them to stay. Every time a new maid arrived, Samuel quietly warned her, "Do your work, keep your distance, and never challenge Miss Mercer." But one Monday morning, another woman arrived at the mansion. Her name was Lorna Reyes, a 39-year-old Filipina housekeeper who had spent years working in difficult homes. She carried one small suitcase, looked at the enormous mansion, and calmly walked through the front doors. Samuel expected nervousness. Instead, Lorna simply asked where she should begin. He stared at her for a moment before quietly saying, "You should know something about this house. The last 14 people didn't leave because they couldn't work. They left because of Vivian." Lorna looked toward the staircase. Then she answered with a calm expression, "Then perhaps someone should finally tell her no." Lorna's first morning began before sunrise. She cleaned the breakfast room, polished the silverware, arranged the flowers, and prepared everything exactly as Samuel had instructed. By 8 o'clock, Vivian entered wearing a pale blush pink designer dress. She glanced at the table and immediately frowned. "Why are the flowers facing that direction?" she asked. Lorna looked at them and politely replied, "Because the morning light reaches them from the windows." Vivian didn't like the answer. She grabbed the vase and pushed it across the table. "I didn't ask for an explanation. I asked you to fix it." Lorna quietly moved the vase. Vivian then noticed a small crease in one of the napkins. "Are you serious? Do you people not know how to do anything properly?" Samuel stood nearby and lowered his eyes. He had seen this before. Most workers would apologize immediately. Lorna did not argue, but she also did not lower her head. "I'll correct the napkin," she said. Vivian stared at her. "And next time, don't make me repeat myself." Lorna folded the napkin carefully. Then she looked directly at Vivian and said, "I understand instructions, Miss Mercer. But I won't accept being insulted." The room became silent. Samuel looked horrified. Vivian's expression changed instantly. "Excuse me." Lorna calmly repeated, "You can correct my work. You can tell me what needs to be done. But you cannot speak to me as though I have no dignity." Vivian walked away without another word. Samuel followed Lorna into the hallway and whispered, "You lasted longer than most." Lorna simply returned to work. By the end of the week, Vivian had decided that Lorna was going to leave just like everyone else. She began creating impossible demands. She ordered Lorna to rearrange the same room several times a day. She demanded breakfast at different times without warning. She deliberately left clothes on the floor after Lorna had cleaned the room and then accused her of being careless. Still, Lorna refused to lose her temper. One afternoon, Vivian returned from shopping and found Lorna organizing the library. "I told Samuel I don't want you touching my books," Vivian snapped. Lorna looked at the shelves. "Samuel asked me to dust the room." Vivian stepped closer. "I don't care what Samuel said. This is my house." Lorna paused. "It is your father's house, Miss Mercer. You live here." Vivian's face hardened. "Are you correcting me now?" "I'm reminding you that other people work here," Lorna replied. Vivian stormed away and immediately called her father. Adrian was in his study reviewing business documents when Vivian entered. "Dad, that woman is disrespectful." Adrian looked up. "What happened?" Vivian explained only her side of the story. Adrian sighed. He knew his daughter had a habit of exaggerating, but he was too busy and too guilty to confront her. I'll speak to Samuel, he promised. Vivian smiled. She believed she had won. But later that evening, Adrian saw Lorna working quietly in the hallway. He noticed something different about her. She wasn't frightened. And for the first time, he wondered whether someone had finally been brave enough to challenge the behavior he had allowed for years. The confrontation came 3 days later. Vivian had invited several friends to the mansion for an afternoon gathering. She expected everything to be perfect. Lorna prepared the dining room, served refreshments, and kept the staff moving quietly through the house. When Vivian noticed a glass sitting in the wrong place, she became furious. She grabbed it and slammed it onto the counter. The glass shattered across the floor. Everyone froze. Vivian pointed toward Lorna. "Clean this up." Lorna looked at the broken pieces. "I'll clean it, but please step back so nobody gets hurt." Vivian laughed. "You really think you're in charge?" "No," Lorna answered. "I'm responsible for keeping people safe." Vivian stepped forward and deliberately knocked another glass from the counter. It shattered near Lorna's shoes. Samuel immediately moved between them. "Miss Mercer, that's enough." Vivian shouted, "You're all useless." Then she turned toward Lorna. "Get out." Lorna stood still. "If Mr. Mercer asks me to leave, I will respect his decision. But you don't have the authority to dismiss me." Vivian's face went pale with anger. At that moment, Adrian appeared at the doorway. He had heard everything. Vivian expected him to defend her. Instead, Adrian looked at the broken glass and then at his daughter. What happened? Vivian started blaming Lorna, but Adrian stopped her. "I heard enough." For the first time, Vivian saw disappointment in her father's eyes instead of protection. Adrian told Samuel to clean the glass and asked Lorna to remain. Then he quietly told Vivian, "We need to talk." That evening, Adrian sat across from Vivian in his study. She expected another lecture that would end with an apology from someone else. Instead, her father placed a folder on the desk. Inside were employment records from the previous year. 14 names were listed. 14 people had quit. Adrian looked at his daughter and said, "Do you know why?" Vivian crossed her arms. "Because they weren't good enough." Adrian shook his head. "No. Because I wasn't a good enough father to teach you how to treat people." Vivian stared at him. She had never heard him speak like that. Adrian admitted that every time an employee complained about her behavior, he had solved the problem with money. He paid people to stay quiet, hired replacements, and avoided confronting Vivian because he was afraid that being strict would damage their relationship. "I thought giving you everything was love," he said. "I was wrong." Vivian's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly looked away. "So you're choosing her over me?" Adrian answered, "This isn't about choosing her. It's about choosing what is right." Vivian left the room angrily. Meanwhile, Lorna was preparing the evening meal when Samuel approached her. He told her Adrian had finally acknowledged what had been happening. Lorna nodded. "He should have done it long ago." Samuel smiled faintly. "Most people would have quit." Lorna replied, "I didn't come here to fight Vivian. I came here to work. But working for someone doesn't mean surrendering your dignity." Samuel realized that was exactly what the house had been missing. For the first time, Adrian began paying attention to what happened inside his own home. He watched how employees interacted with Vivian. He noticed the nervous silence whenever she entered a room. He noticed how people avoided eye contact because they were afraid of becoming her next target. Adrian realized that the problem was larger than one spoiled teenager. He had created an environment where wealth protected bad behavior. Vivian, however, refused to accept the change. She began testing Lorna in quieter ways. She would leave expensive jewelry on the floor and accuse Lorna of moving it. She would deliberately change instructions and then claim Lorna had failed. But every time, Lorna calmly documented what had happened and refused to argue. One morning, Vivian accused her of damaging a designer handbag. "You touched it, didn't you?" Vivian demanded. Lorna answered, "I cleaned the table beside it." "I did not touch your bag." Vivian threatened to have her fired. Lorna looked at her and said, "You can report me if you believe I did something wrong. but I won't confess to something I didn't do." Adrian happened to hear the exchange from the hallway. He stepped inside and asked Vivian to show him the damage. The bag was untouched. Vivian had invented the accusation. Adrian's expression hardened. "That's enough." Vivian looked stunned. "Dad, no," Adrian said. "Lorna doesn't have to prove her worth every time you become angry." It was the first time he had openly defended an employee against his own daughter. The next morning, Adrian called a meeting with Samuel, Lorna, and Vivian. He made one rule clear. Everyone in the house would be treated with respect, regardless of their position. Vivian remained silent, but her eyes showed resentment. Lorna did not celebrate her victory. She simply listened. Adrian then turned to Vivian and said, "If you want independence, you must learn responsibility." Vivian asked what that meant. Adrian told her she would spend the next several weeks working alongside the household staff. She would not receive special treatment. She would learn what it took to maintain the home she took for granted. Vivian laughed bitterly. "You're making me clean." Adrian replied, "I'm making you understand." The following morning, Vivian entered the laundry room wearing ordinary work clothes. Samuel showed her how to sort linens. She struggled almost immediately. She complained about the heat, the weight of the baskets, and the repetitive work. Lorna watched from a distance but said nothing until Vivian nearly dropped a basket. "Don't rush," Lorna advised. Vivian snapped, "I don't need your help." Lorna stepped back. "Then learn at your own pace." Hours later, Vivian's hands were tired. She had never realized how much work happened behind the scenes of the mansion. Every clean room, polished window, folded towel, and prepared meal required someone's time. That evening, she sat alone in her bedroom and looked at her hands. For the first time, she understood that the people she had insulted were doing work she had never even noticed. Days passed, and Vivian slowly began changing, although she fought the change every step of the way. She still became impatient, but she began catching herself before speaking cruelly. She started learning the names of employees she had previously ignored. One afternoon, Lorna found Vivian struggling to carry a heavy basket of laundry. Vivian looked embarrassed. Lorna quietly took one side. Together, they carried it down the hallway. Vivian expected a lecture. Instead, Lorna said, "Everyone needs help sometimes." Vivian looked at her. "Why are you still helping me after everything I did?" Lorna answered, "Because being kind doesn't mean approving of someone's behavior." Vivian was silent. Then she asked, "Were you ever treated like this before?" Lorna nodded. She explained that she had worked hard after moving from the Philippines and had learned that some people confused wealth with importance. "Money can open doors," she said, "but it cannot make people respect you." Vivian asked what had made Lorna so fearless. Lorna smiled gently. "I have responsibilities bigger than my fear. I support my family. I learned long ago that losing a job is difficult, but losing your self-respect can cost much more." Vivian remembered every time she had used money to frighten someone into obedience. For the first time, she felt ashamed. That night, she walked past the staff area and quietly said goodnight to everyone. It was a small gesture, but Samuel noticed. So did Lorna. A week later, Vivian made a decision nobody expected. She asked Lorna if she could apologize to the employees she had treated badly. Lorna told her that an apology meant nothing unless her behavior changed afterward. Vivian agreed. She started with Carla, a former housekeeper who still worked part-time at the estate. Vivian approached her nervously and said, "I treated you badly because I thought you couldn't leave. I was wrong." Carla looked surprised. Vivian continued, "You didn't deserve the things I said. I'm sorry." Carla accepted the apology, but she also told Vivian that words had to be followed by actions. Vivian understood. Over the next several weeks, she became more respectful. She stopped shouting instructions and started asking politely. She began helping with small tasks without being asked. She even thanked the kitchen staff for preparing her meals. Adrian watched quietly from a distance. One evening, he told Vivian he was proud of her, but she interrupted him. "Don't say you're proud yet. I'm still learning." Adrian smiled. That's exactly why I'm proud. Meanwhile, Lorna received an unexpected phone call from her brother Ethan Reyes. Ethan was working on plans for a small training center that would help workers develop practical skills. Lorna told him about Vivian's transformation. Ethan laughed and said, maybe she finally met someone who didn't fear her. Lorna smiled. Maybe she finally met herself. The biggest test came during a charity event at Mercer Estate. Wealthy guests arrived from across the city, and the mansion filled with music, conversation, and expensive clothing. Vivian was responsible for welcoming several guests. In the past, she would have treated the staff like invisible servants. Instead, she personally thanked them for their work. One guest noticed and complimented her behavior. Vivian simply smiled. Later that evening, a wealthy businessman accidentally spilled a drink near a staff member and blamed her for it. Vivian immediately stepped forward. That wasn't her fault. I saw what happened. The man laughed. Why defend a housekeeper? Vivian looked him directly in the eyes. Because she's a person. The room became quiet. Adrian watched from across the hall, visibly moved. Lorna heard the exchange and smiled. But the evening wasn't over. During the event, Adrian announced that the family would create a new program to support household and service workers who wanted training and better opportunities. He invited Ethan Reyes to help design it. Ethan stood before the guests and explained that the goal was not charity alone. It was opportunity. Vivian surprised everyone by volunteering to help. She said she wanted to learn how to build something that could improve people's lives instead of simply spending money. Lorna stood nearby, proud but quiet. She knew the girl who had once driven 14 workers away was finally becoming someone different. After the charity event, Vivian's transformation became impossible to ignore. She began spending several afternoons helping Ethan organize the worker support program. She reviewed training schedules, helped prepare materials, and listened to workers explain the challenges they faced. For the first time, she saw how difficult life could be outside the protected world of her family. One worker told her that losing a job could mean losing a home. Another explained that many people had skills but lacked the opportunity to prove themselves. Vivian listened without interrupting. Later, she told Ethan, I used to think everyone was asking for something from me. Ethan answered, sometimes people aren't asking for money. They're asking to be seen. Those words stayed with her. At home, Vivian also began spending more time with her father. Their relationship slowly changed. Adrian no longer tried to solve every problem with money, and Vivian stopped expecting him to. One evening, they sat together overlooking Blackwater Cove. Vivian admitted that she had been angry because she believed her father was always busy choosing his business over her. Adrian admitted that he had been so afraid of failing her that he had failed to guide her. Neither blamed the other. They simply talked. From the doorway, Lorna watched for a moment before quietly walking away. She knew some wounds could not be repaired in a single conversation. But they could begin healing when people finally told the truth. Months passed, and the Mercer household became almost unrecognizable. Employees no longer walked through the mansion with fear in their eyes. Vivian greeted them by name. She asked instead of demanded. She listened instead of interrupting. And when she made a mistake, she apologized without blaming someone else. One afternoon, Vivian found Lorna preparing a room for a family gathering. She stood quietly beside her and said, "You changed my life." Lorna smiled. "You changed it yourself. I only refused to let you treat me badly." Vivian shook her head. "But if you had quit like everyone else, I might never have understood." Lorna answered, "Sometimes one person has to stay long enough to tell the truth." Vivian then handed Lorna a small envelope. Inside was a formal proposal for the Worker Support Foundation. Lorna read it carefully and realized Vivian had included funding for emergency assistance, job training, and educational opportunities. "You actually did it," Lorna said. Vivian smiled. "We did it." Lorna corrected her gently. "No. You chose to do it." Vivian looked at her and said, "Then I'll keep choosing it." That evening, Adrian announced that the foundation would become a permanent part of the Mercer family business. It would operate independently and help workers who needed training and financial support. Ethan would lead the training center, while Lorna would help oversee worker programs. Vivian would assist with outreach and fundraising. The mansion that had once represented privilege was beginning to represent responsibility. The official opening of the Worker Support Center took place several months later. Families gathered outside while banners and flowers decorated the entrance. Ethan stood beside the doors, greeting people as they arrived. Lorna watched proudly as workers entered classrooms for training programs in hospitality, administration, and skilled trades. Vivian stood beside her father and looked around at the people whose lives were beginning to change. Adrian leaned toward her and said, "You understand now." Vivian nodded. "More than I ever did before." A reporter asked Vivian why she had decided to create the foundation. She could have talked about her family's wealth or her father's business. Instead, she simply said, "I learned that having power means nothing if you use it to make people afraid." Lorna heard the statement and smiled. Later, Vivian asked Lorna to speak privately. She admitted that she still felt ashamed of the person she had been. Lorna told her, "You should remember her, but don't let her control you. Guilt can keep you trapped in the past. Responsibility helps you build the future." Vivian hugged her. It was the first time they had embraced. Adrian watched them from across the room. He realized that Lorna had never entered his home intending to change his family. She had simply refused to surrender her dignity. That one decision had forced everyone around her to reconsider what strength really meant. 1 year after Lorna first arrived at Mercer Estate, Adrian hosted a private dinner for the people who had helped transform his family. Samuel, Ethan, Lorna, Vivian, and several former employees sat around the same table. Adrian stood and raised his glass. "A year ago, I thought the biggest problem in my house was my daughter," he said. "I was wrong. The biggest problem was that I had taught her that money could erase consequences." Vivian looked down, emotional. Adrian continued, "Lorna taught us something I should have taught Vivian from the beginning. Respect is not something you buy. It is something you give." Samuel smiled. Ethan nodded. Lorna remained humble. Vivian then stood. She looked around the table and said, "I used to believe people worked for me because I was important. Now I understand that every person has a life, a family, a struggle, and a dignity that doesn't depend on their job." She turned toward Lorna. "You were the first person who told me no." Lorna smiled. "And you were finally willing to listen." Everyone laughed softly. Later that night, Vivian walked outside toward the ocean. Adrian joined her. For a moment, they stood silently beneath the stars. Vivian said, "Dad, do you think people can really change?" Adrian looked at his daughter. "Yes. But only when they're brave enough to admit they need to." Vivian smiled. For the first time, the mansion felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Years later, the story of Lorna Reyes was still remembered at Mercer Estate. Not because she had become wealthy or famous, but because she had walked into a mansion filled with power and refused to believe that power made one person more valuable than another. Vivian became deeply involved in the Worker Support Foundation. She helped expand training programs, emergency assistance, and educational opportunities for families who had once been overlooked. Ethan's training center grew into a respected organization, while Samuel continued managing the estate with a very different atmosphere than before. Adrian remained successful in business, but his priorities changed. He spent more time with his family and stopped using money as a substitute for guidance. And Lorna continued working with the foundation, quietly helping people who reminded her of where she had once started. One evening, Vivian returned to Blackwater Cove and found Lorna standing near the garden overlooking the ocean. Vivian smiled and said, "Do you remember your first day here?" Lorna laughed. "I remember Samuel warning me that 14 people had already quit." Vivian smiled. "And you said no." Lorna looked toward the mansion. Sometimes the most powerful word a person can say is no. Not because they want to control someone else, but because they finally understand their own worth. Vivian nodded. The girl who once believed wealth gave her power had learned a different truth. True strength was never about making people afraid. It was about having enough character to respect them. And sometimes, all it took to change an entire family was one fearless person who simply refused to accept less.